welcome to another episode of our Pre-Symposium panel as we ramp up for our Executive Symposium this Thursday, February 15th from 5 to 8 p.m. in Austin, Texas. If you are a leader, you're interested in connecting with other leaders, if you want to talk about how to build a culture of accountability, I'd highly encourage you to come to this event. I will post in the comments how to RSVP. But the topic for this Executive Symposium and for our Pre-Symposium panel today is how to build a culture of accountability. We've got three great leaders that will be at the event on Thursday here with us today to share their thoughts on what they found to be effective in terms of building a culture of accountability. We've got Kaitlyn, we've got Jeanna, we've got Lou. Lou, do you mind kicking us off with an intro?
Sure. I'm Lou Senko. Glad to be here. I'm Chief Availability Officer at an Austin-based company called Q2. Q2 sits between 34 million users and about 1,400 banks and credit unions providing their online banking experience. And we're a mission-driven company, so we believe that the best way to help the communities that we all live in is to help that local financial institution that lives within that community, whose own mission is to invest back in that community. And we just don't want to see a day where there's 5 big banks that get to decide who can start a business, who can go back to school, who can buy a house. And so I'm part of the teams that are responsible for delivering those services to those users around uptime, performance, quality, and security and compliance.
Cool. Kaitlyn, how about you?
Absolutely. Thanks, Garrett. So my name is Kaitlyn Flynn. I am a product strategy and operations leader, and I've spent my entire career in the education and ed tech fields. And I have a unique focus on supporting students as they're transitioning from one place to the next in life. So whether it's from high school to college or from college or some sort of education to career, that's where I really like to focus. And I myself was a first generation college student and didn't have all of the supports that I wish I had had. And so I've dedicated my life to making sure I can build and provide those supports for learners throughout their journey. I also hold 2 master's degrees, so I did eventually figure out the higher education system, fortunately, through the support of really good advisors. And I have a degree in educational psychology, which is a fancy way to say counseling. And I also have my MBA. And though I've never been a counselor by trade, I use my counseling knowledge and that experience every single day in my approach to building teams, leading teams, working cross-functionally across companies. And then I went back to get my MBA a couple of years ago just to round out that human side of me with the business side so that I can bring that strategic business thinking to it. And all of that informs my empathetic leadership approach to building teams, building a culture of trust and accountability like we're talking about today.
Cool. And Jeanna, how about you?
Thank you. I'm Jeanna Kozak, and I am an organization designer. Organization design is the process and practice of aligning resources to deliver strategy. It's part of the organization effectiveness umbrella, which would also include culture and strategy. So I've worked externally and internally in large organizations, expanding capability and also contracting capability as needed to meet business needs.
Very nice. And I'm Garrett Mintz. I'm the founder of Ambition in Motion. At Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality. And when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders, because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. And so we create technologies and communities to empower leaders to be their best selves for their teams. One of the ways we build that community is bringing leaders together to talk about the challenges they face in building company culture, in growing their teams, improving team performance, and improving team productivity. So today's topic is how to build a company culture of accountability. So Kaitlyn, Jeanna, Lou, I love to just learn, when it comes to accountability, one, I guess, how do you go about building a culture of accountability? And within that question, I'd also love to learn, because I think like we always talk about the success stories and like how I became a great, success, whatever, with building our company culture. I'd also love to learn pitfalls. Like, what are mistakes that you've made in the process of building a culture of accountability that maybe you realize in hindsight, gosh, I might have messed that part up, and this is what I learned from that experience. So what have you learned in terms of building a culture of accountability, and what were some mistakes that you made that you've learned from in terms of actions that you thought would help build a culture of accountability, but in reality did the opposite? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. So
Yep.
when I think about building accountability, I think about three things. I think about relationships, leading with relationships, centering the why for people, and then leading by example. So relationships, no surprise, the person with the counseling background believes in that. But I think that's the foundation upon which everything gets done in a company, is that you have to know people, and people have to know that you like them and that you care about them and that you believe in them. And I think that goes up and down the ladder with leadership to direct reports, but I think it also goes across with peers within teams. If we're going to build this as a culture, it can't just be one direction. I think everyone has to know each other and genuinely like each other in order to move forward. Now, you don't like every single thing about everybody you work with. That's okay, but finding the humanity and starting with relationships. And then I think helping people understand the why of what they're doing. People generally don't just want to check a box and say, okay, I just did that thing. Like you said, Gary, if you want to go home and feel fulfilled, checking a box throughout the day and not understanding why you're checking it probably isn't this path to get there. So I think if you know people and you understand their motivations, you understand their goals, you can help them understand why this goal is important, or why, when they're falling short on something, why you're going to hold them accountable to doing better and to reaching and to growing. But I think, again, if you don't have the relationship, you can't connect with people. So I think building relationships, connecting with the why, and then as a leader, showing your faults, right? So if somebody calls you out, if somebody points out something that you're not doing or holds you accountable, whether publicly or privately, thanking them for that and making sure that you make it known that you yourself are not infallible, because nobody is, and showing that you can be accountable. So whenever somebody would call me out in a meeting, I would say, thank you, I appreciate that, and work to correct that either in the moment or afterwards, to show that I am also part of this culture of accountability. This doesn't go, again, it's not one directional. This is everybody is part of this culture. So those are the big things. And I'll stop there to let somebody else jump in. I definitely have pitfalls that I'll share, but I'll take a moment to let somebody else jump in.
Yeah.
Accountability is thwarted by bureaucracy. So 15 managers, it doesn't matter how competent they are. If there's too many of them, they're bumping elbows and trying to find decisions to make, and things grind to a screeching halt, or the incentives are counterproductive. So you asked about, so the question, I think, is to say, what can we not do, and how important this is or isn't? And you ask about pitfalls. I think it's a couple of things. One is not being aggressive enough in around what you can not do. I mean, what can you really stop doing? It's very instructive, I think, that Twitter, now X, was able to eliminate 70% or so of the staff, and they're still functioning just fine. Facebook had a really, now Meta had a really high number as well, 20% or something like that. And you previously think that was unheard of, but if that's coming out of bureaucracy, it's going to enhance productivity. So you ask about pitfalls. I think it is a couple things. One is not being aggressive enough in figuring out these priorities. And the other one is that functioning well, really thriving in accountability, is more about other people than any of us would like to admit. We all want to believe that we are, really contributing and we really matter. But if you look to sports teams, it's very instructive, because, and I won't name any names, but you can find an example of somebody who was, first round draft pick, absolutely wonderful. They go to a team and belly flop. They get to another team and they thrive. The team matters. And so I think the other pitfalls there are really trying to figure out that optimal composition in addition to the structure.
Yeah, and well said. I'll add a little bit around. We think of accountability kind of in two flavors. There's an accountability that's more of a negative connotation around you're not being accountable. And so when I say make someone accountable, that has a negative connotation. There's another one that's really more about ownership, and we really want them to take more ownership, and it's all a path and a glide forward and up. And the way we look at the problems, if we're not getting the outcomes that we want, we divide it into, are we having a problem with accountability in that or is it a problem with ownership? And so we have a kind of a very structured format that we take these kind of steps around creating accountability. And it starts way back at the beginning with a very candid conversation around, and the person's usually in denial. And then we have the candid conversation that kind of moves them up to kind of blame. Right. And then blame, we focus on a conversation that says, well, what can you control? And then that moves into excuses, right? And then we talk about excuses, and it's not, hey, I'm not blaming you. We're trying to simplify it, and we're trying to move it up into, well, then it's an anxiety step. And they're talking about, all the anxiety they have about trying to get there. And then we talk about, well, what are the expectations? What does success look like? And we kind of go from this denial that there's a problem to blaming other people, to having a bunch of excuses, to being really anxious about being successful, to success because I know what I can be measured on. And that path is kind of how we kind of work, intentionally through any problem. The mistakes I've made in the past is I'm looking at outcomes I didn't want or didn't like, and trying to deal with it without going through that process. And so, there's a person in denial, and you're complaining about their outcomes. And so, getting back into having the candor conversation, what's really going on, that there is in fact a problem. What information am I missing? Getting more information so I can help you. And that's all part of that. Listen first. Quit jumping to conclusions. Put that aside. Get in. Roll up your sleeves. Let's go through this together. That's been when I've made mistakes, is because I've been too anxious, jumping on it too quickly, and not going through that process.
You're giving me a lot to work with, y'all. I like it. So, Jeanna, you bring up really interesting points. I love the example. I think it's really, you bring up the really interesting point about Twitter, now X, and even Meta, and a ton of companies are laying off people right now. And I think so often, I think the public sentiment is oh, these companies suck, they're laying off people. But you bring up a really good point. They're still running. Obviously, I would imagine that who's left is still having to do a lot of work, and it's probably really stressful. And I would imagine adapting to what's most important and aligning incentives is there's an initial challenging point. But you bring up a great point of it's still running and it's still doing fine, and they were able to get rid of probably a lot of bureaucracy that had existed in the first place. And Lou, you bring up a really interesting point about accountability versus ownership. And when you make pitfalls, it's when we get into the blame game. And when it comes to honestly, when I'm hearing it, almost sounds like the bureaucracy that Jeanna's talking about. So I love to just kind of bring that to a head here and talk a little bit more. I guess maybe the question I'm coming, first with is, how can we go about better properly aligning incentives so then we can understand if we're operating efficiently or not? Does that question make sense?
It does. I can jump in there. When you're working, even smaller organizations, I think it doesn't take very long to get incentives that aren't aligned. And I think that's actually the place to start looking, rather than say, what are the incentives? Say, where are my incentives in conflict? Because if you can tackle that first, you're going to get a lot more traction. And then from there, what that tells you is you can look at it in terms of a strategic group of actions and tactical. And the strategic ones will be something along the lines of a bad customer experience. And it's very important to hone in on what is bad about the customer experience. Because if you think about yourself as a customer, there's 7 steps to any given transaction. All of them are fine, except perhaps step number 5. And step number 5 will make you so furious you won't go back again. That's what needs to be fixed. So it's honing in on that will often fix a lot of things, and it'll probably have misaligned incentives. That's what's causing the bad customer experience. A couple other places to look are politics and culture. I mean, what norm do you want? If you have one group working, for example, to have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, can we just give an example of your previous example? Because I can think of it right now, but just for our audience and for us listening here, it sounds like an example of what you're talking about of misaligned incentives could be a customer success agent who's incentivized by speed of talk time to a customer, not based on satisfaction from said call experience.
Perfect example. Happens all the time. Yeah.
If I'm incentivized, hey, I got to get off this phone in the next 1 minute, I'm incentivized to hang up that phone, regardless of whether or not the person on the other side is satisfied with how their experience was with me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And another simple one that I would give you is your hotel stay, because the cleaning people need to get their rooms done. And maybe you want to stay a little longer. It'd be a better experience. There's some misaligned incentives there too. So you can find them, all across the spectrum. But what you just gave was a perfect example. And it's a great place to start. And you can often get a lot of traction with that, just finding those misaligned incentives. The experience will point you to the incentives, and looking for the lack of alignment versus what are my incentives and taking an inventory of them is much faster and probably much more productive. And then I'll just add to that a couple other things to look at that are relatively easy is technology. There's a concept, I think McKinsey is the origin of this, but I'm not entirely certain, that they talk about a technology debt, a bunch of point solutions as opposed to having a systemic view. It's mentioned in a lot of places, but that's another place to look. Where's my highest technology debt? Because that's probably misaligned incentives and slowing things down as well. And then the other area I'd offer to look is partnerships. And partnerships with vendors or internally, there's a tendency to treat them all the same, and they're not. And simple example: are you dating, or are you getting married? Are you doing a project together, or are you going to sink or swim together? And your relationship needs to be defined differently, and the way you work needs to be defined differently based upon the answer to that question. And if that's misaligned, that's probably going to create a lot of slowdowns and lack of productivity and loss of decision making as well. So 3 easy ways to find the biggest problem and move things forward. On the process that Lou mentioned, process matters all the time. Find the problem, have a hypothesis, do a test, execute.
Maybe to build on that thinking around misalignments, most of our leaders have got to where they are because they can deliver. And the five, one of the favorite books we look at is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And when you think about how that works, kind of the final part of that pyramid is that no one team can be successful if they're not all successful. And I think that's one of the pieces that breaks down at the end, where each of the groups, as the organizations get more complex, each of the leaders are very good at driving their thing and getting their goals done. And then if overall the project isn't successful, then that's where the blame around, well, it's not me, I got my stuff done, these things didn't get done, that's why it didn't get done, without taking also the ownership of the overall goal being done. And that's always the top of the pyramid. That's the hardest one. We've gone through the 5 dysfunctions multiple times in my career, different teams I've been involved with. And that's the hardest one to pull together, is that kind of shared accountability around the ultimate goal together, and how to foster that trust, and how to foster that connectivity, that it's not just your team and what you own and how you drive it, but the influence and the combination of the leaders together. And that's why, where you look at a Facebook where they've trimmed a bunch of white collar management staff out, and it keeps working. It's because those leaders weren't really adding the value to the bigger solution set, and the ICs doing the job are still needed to do the job, but the management and the oversight, the governance, really wasn't driving to the collective win.
So, Lou and Kaitlyn, I'd love for you to jump in on this, because I'd be curious to learn your thoughts. But Lou, I think you share that leaders get there because of their ability to deliver. I would care to argue in a lot of organizations, leaders get there because of tenure. Not necessarily for right or wrong, they get there because they've been there for long enough. It's like, whoa. How can John Doe get promoted ahead of me? I've been here for 5 years longer than John Doe has. Well, but the thing is, tenure always, I feel, it's like plays a role, but I think also is a large contributor into the bureaucracy that Jeanna's talking about, of like, well, everybody has this consistent pay raise every single year, and like, after 3 years they move up to this track, and it's like, not everybody's on the same track, not everyone's riding the same train, and that may not even be what the individual wants too. So how can we overcome that? How can we audit beyond just mass layoffs? Is there a way that we can like preemptively get to auditing our leaders' performance and where they're at, and like whether or not it makes sense to continue moving them up, or like, create a socially acceptable and ego-friendly way of maybe demoting them, but into a role that they're going to enjoy and do better in anyways? Like, what have you found within any of that?
Well, I tell you, we are, I've been with companies now that have started very small and they've grown to be very big, and there's kind of seasons to all this behavior and the organization, and Jeanna can probably talk more about the organization development. But when you think about how everyone's a generalist at the beginning, and then departments get big enough that you need people that are specialists in this. And then finally, those departments get big enough that you need multiple specialists, so it becomes more generalist again. And it kind of comes together, takes apart, comes together, takes apart as you scale. And that you build on individuals. And I think Malcolm has a great analogy here, but I always look at it between hockey and soccer. In hockey, you have some all-stars you build a team around. And if you want a better team, you get better all-stars. Soccer is a very different, it's a team sport, and it's all about your weakest player because everyone touches the ball, everyone's part of that. And so you raise the overall team by raising the weakest parts. And so it's a very different, and so you start a company as a hockey team, but you evolve into a soccer team, and governance and some of the ways, best practices and the ways replace individuals that can drive things. And so anyways, when we think about, how everyone gets promoted to a job where they finally get to an incompetence level. It's a job that they can't get past, right? And that Peter Principle piece of it. And so we all are the way we try to counteract that is be very performance driven in the way we give awards. So it's OKRs, it's KPIs, even our annual review process goes through a 9-box of performance versus potential. And we're very intentional about talking about what the people are doing against expectations, what we feel their potential is, and how they demonstrate potential to be at the job above them. Again, 8% of the people that are high performers will be high performers at the next level. So you have to be just very aware that by taking even a rock star and promoting them, chances are they're not going to be a rock star anymore because the expectations just went up. And I think what happens a lot is we're not being aware enough around how expectations are rising much faster than individuals are growing. And hence why we keep adding people that are skilled or have skills that are at the next level to our organization because we weren't able to move people up fast enough. But to your point, if you have metrics and you have ways to measure outcomes that are unbiased, you start giving awards for results. And I think that at least is the cleanest way to measure some of this, is that you reward results. You create a culture where, hey, I didn't get something they got. Well, they did these things and they got this outcomes and they were rewarded for that. You want to have those same rewards. You just need to have that same impact. At least that is something that is, not biased from a manager point of view.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So Lou, I agree that companies have to be very clear about what the standards are. And I think there is a lack of clarity and a lack of just putting it out there for people and saying, okay, you want to go from level 1 to level 2. Here is what that takes. Here are the very specific things you'll be measured on. People are usually guessing. And then because we don't have those standards, it's just sort of like, yeah, you're next in line. Go ahead. You get to move on up. But where I disagree with you, Lou, is that it's only performance-based. I think OKRs, KPIs, whatever it is your company uses, I absolutely think those matter. And you do have to perform and succeed. But I don't think it's just about performance and those hard numbers. I think it's also about the whole person. So it's about what is their leadership style? What is their retention or turnover on their team? Like looking at some of the other factors. How do they lead? How do they show up in moments of crisis? Have they taken accountability for failures? Have they publicly said this was a failure and here's what we're going to do about it? How do they respond, not just in the good times when performance is going really well, but also in the tough times? And I think those also need to be defined. What are those characteristics? Is it empathy? Is it authenticity? Is it whatever the leadership characteristics might be that are required for that next level? I also think those need to be clear, because I think performance indicators, to your point, Lou, somebody's a rock star here, and then you 9-box them in their next role, and all of a sudden they're really low. What's the gap there? Maybe it's performance, but I would venture a guess that it's also some of those more human-centered, some of those softer skills where they didn't know how to appropriately cross-functionally collaborate, or they could not problem solve with somebody off their team, or whatever it might be. I think those are really important, and again, have to be defined. But I don't think OKRs are the only thing that get people that build successful leaders.
Wouldn't you say building and coaching teams or building alliances is part of a manager's job, and therefore are things that you can measure and reward on? So when I say performance, I don't just mean profit. I also mean building alliances, building coaching teams. Obviously, those are longer arc things that if you can shortcut them, you get immediate results, but longer term, you don't. And so you have to do both the long and the short to be successful. But totally agree. It was a great call out to be specific around. There's managers do more than just deliver on financial results. There's a team aspect of what they do.
Yeah.
So I want to add in, there's an odd organizational dynamic that I wish people would research more. But for some reason, when prosperity happens, organizations do not focus on their core capability. They expand bureaucracy. I think it starts off as a genuine desire to scale something. And then human ambition takes over, and pretty soon they're looking for opportunities. So you'll see that with universities where, you think they'd endow another professor. They don't. They build a swimming pool in a university in Florida or a snow machine in a university in Colorado. You see it in government all the time. There's another bureau and another set of rules. You see it in business. You'll see a plethora of culture people and communications people and chief of staffs and admins, and this is where the investment goes. And then I genuinely think human ambition takes over a lot of what you've been talking about. They want to matter, they want to make an impact, and they want compensation. So I think to Garrett's question around how to kind of try to at least slow this, if you can't thwart it entirely, there's a couple of things. One is the compensation audit. There's a trend towards salaries being much more public. Now, that doesn't fix that a lot of executive compensation things are frankly buried, in stock options and various other perks. But the compensation audit and transparency will help. There's things and just in demand towards many more generalists, professional track. And you'll see in most companies in their compensation structure, there's a managerial track and, how many people you supervise and what that's going to look like and how you're promoted. There's also a professional track. It tends to be applied to like clinical professions and technology professions right now. That could be more widely applied. I think it might actually be welcomed favorably because I don't think everybody wants to be a leader of people. I think it's sort of like, adopting a pet or having kids. It's a calling. And, not everybody wants to do it, and that's okay. I think many people would like to be a professional. They just want to make more money. So they become a manager, even though that's not really what they want to do. And if you're doing something you don't really want to do, you're not likely to excel at it. So I think those are a couple of things that get to your question, Garrett.
No, that's a great point, Jeanna. I like it. Lou, you brought up a fascinating stat. I've never heard of it. I wonder if that's like an internal metric that you've identified or if this is universal and maybe I'm just not aware of it, but only 8% of the top performers are top performers at the next level. I've never heard that before, but it's crazy. I mean, it's interesting. Is that like, tell me more about that, and what could be the cause of that?
Well, I won't profess to know all the answers, but that's a stat from what used to be called CEB. It was purchased by Gartner, so it's part of the Gartner Foundation knowledge there. And we use that as we think about the 9 box and just how do we think about 2 axes around performance. You're meeting performance, you're exceeding performance, you're behind developing in performance, or potential, which is much trickier around are you high potential, low potential, medium potential. And potential is one of these tricky ones that often I think managers mistake enthusiasm as potential. And how do you break that down? And I know we did. We had a lot of people in high potential, and then when I mapped it over the years, where those people ended up, they didn't end up in our top box of highest performers, highest potential. They ended up either dropping down to medium performance or leaving the company. And so what were we doing wrong trying to guess what potential was? And we dissected it, and there's actually some very foundational questions you can ask around behaviors that would identify more potential versus less potential. And so we've incorporated that as a feedback loop into how we use this to rank and rate people. But again, I think potential is probably the biggest thing, especially in high tech. What about the technology today doesn't get you the job, but every about 18 months, we throw it all out. And they're saying every technical certification or knowledge now only has a shelf life of about 2.5 years. So it's really about a trajectory of learning that we're hiring for. And the fact that you've learned this stuff and you're going to get here, we're going to change it all on you and you're going to learn new stuff. That trajectory of learning that where you're never tired, you've got the personal habits of always continuing to be curious and learning. That's really what we're hiring for now. And we kind of pressure test that on, give me the evidence that you've learned over your past time. And that, for example, we have a OKR of 20 hours of learning every quarter. So every employee is enticed to keep learning as part of how we show up at work.
That's interesting, Lou. I think it's super cool that you have 20 hours of learning every quarter. And that a trajectory of learning that is a character component when hiring, I think, is really big. But I think that there's an argument to be made that when fewer people have done the job, there's less information and roadmaps for success for people to actually be successful in that next result. Because let's think about it, like only 8% of top performers at the managerial level end up becoming top performers at the director level. And then only 8% of those top performers at the VP level become successful to get to the C-suite level, however a hierarchy may be. The argument could be made there's just been fewer people who've been in the C-suite level. There have been fewer people who've been in the VP level. And so there's not a really great, clear roadmap for people to be successful in that VP role compared to, let's say, a specialist role when they first got started, because maybe you've had thousands of people in that role and be like, cool, we know this is not the way to behave, but this is the way to behave. Would you say that's like a fair argument in the space in terms of why? I guess maybe the question is more along the lines of, do you think companies need to be better at about creating a better roadmap as people promote and escalate throughout the organization?
I probably am controversial, so I'll say it, and then I'm sure Kaitlyn and Jeanna are going to correct me here. But my thinking is that as companies grow, complexity of the roles of the jobs grow, and as you hire and you keep adding people and you're onboarding people and expectations keep growing, the talent density actually drops. And it's not because you're hiring not smart people. It's the complexity of the roles getting hard. You don't have all the pieces in place to keep them going. So, what I try to do is lower the complexity and hire as well as we can. But we always have this gap between what's expected and what we can deliver. And that's where the chaos exists. And as the company grows, that chaos is a lot of pain. And so companies want to put in a bunch of rules, a bunch of firm policies, a bunch of ways to do things, a bunch of governance. And that feels good initially because the chaos is lessened. But what it does over time is it makes the organization brittle because there's a prescribed way of doing everything. It takes all the ambiguity out. And then the market changes or the expectations change, and you've got a very brittle organization that can't adapt because there's a way to do everything. It's all prescribed. And then all the talented people that kind of built the company kind of leave because they like the ambiguity, they like having the influence, they like having new ideas. And by trying to address the bottom performers with a general plan, you also kind of clip the top performers, so they can't do anything different either, right? And so I love trying to lower complexity, trying to raise talent density, but living with a little bit of chaos so that your top performers can still surprise you. And that it's not all on your shoulders to know what good looks like at the next level. It's not always on your shoulders to know what's around the corner. You have smart people that can surprise you if you just let them go with enough guardrails that don't, ruin the company. But at the end of the day, to think that you're going to have a plan for everything is, I think, the limiting factor that you can become average pretty quickly because your plans you can't predict everything. You just kind of numb everything down into a plan.
I want to add to that by pointing out an attribute. I think you're absolutely right. But I think the problem is a lot of people think what made them successful will make them successful. So they go do the exact same thing again. Really good example of that is a few years ago, JCPenney's hired as their CEO somebody from Apple. Now the JCPenney demographic wants to hunt and find sales. They want to feel like they won, with playing the discounts and all that. And he came in and did what he did at Apple, which is create a boutique. Completely different demographic, complete faceplant. So I think extending what you just said, Lou, is really looking for that ability to reinvent. If you have that, then in addition to everything you said, that is going to be what moves things forward, because, that was that company and those people, and this is this company and these people. And you've got to be able to transfer those skills. And I think that is the thing that is most overlooked in hiring and placing these roles. They'll get a cultural fit with the executives, but that's probably not what you need. Transforming industries, financial services, I'm pretty sure, ended up like Wells Fargo and American Express, and these people 10 or 12 years ago had to replace 70% of their top line. I mean, they just couldn't get there from here. And you can find that story in other industries as well. And I think that's the attribute that's missing.
So interesting. So Gene, that's a really good story because it highlights a lack of understanding of either what your current clients want or a desire for someone on the executive team to change the client base into something different than what it is and what you want it to be. And I would imagine that probably in the JCPenney scenario and example you gave, the latter is probably the case. It was like, cool, like, don't get me wrong, like a majority of our client base wants to be like a truffle pig for a good deal on jeans. But at the end of the day, like, we would much rather have higher margins on, really bespoke jeans that you can't find anywhere else and have a really high margin on that. But it's like our client base isn't that. So you would be essentially turning over the entire client base. And so therefore the Apple hire was probably misaligned or misinformed. But the point you bring up is, I think, really critical in the sense that these are common mistakes leaders and executives make when it comes to trying to build a culture of accountability on a micro level where they input incentives that are not aligned with where the organization is going. And so how do we go about auditing our incentives and just like regularly looking at them? Because I mean, I don't know how it is within the organizations you all have worked in. Sometimes it comes from the top and the executive team. Sometimes it comes from middle management. Sometimes it's, anywhere in between. How can we go about auditing the incentives we put in place? Because without being micromanagers, does that question make sense?
I don't think it's so much the incentives and what we're talking about now. I think it's back to the composition question. It's putting together the team that has the adequate amount of like foundational knowledge of the business to be like, well, you don't want to be completely have your feet in concrete where, we tried that and it didn't work. And but they have knowledge. So you want a positive history, or a positive expression of history rather. And you want somebody that can actually reinvent and see possibilities. I think that composition is really the challenge. I think the incentives would follow if you had that right. So I think it's kind of the other way around with the chicken and the egg. I think the incentives might be driving the keeping things the same. I mean, in the example that we were just talking about, it might be, either driving keeping the customer base, or if it's driving going to a completely new set of customers, that's a really risky proposition, to flip a switch like that. So the incentives are not aligned to be able to make that a journey rather than a flipping of a switch.
I also,
oh yeah,
okay. I was just saying, I also think like understanding, so if there's a team that has this great composition, but maybe I'm on a different team, maybe I'm not aligned, maybe I'm not, motivated to do whatever that team is doing. So I think understanding the why are we going this way? If we are JCPenney, why are we trying to flip our consumer culture from JCPenney to an Apple culture? Like why, like help me get bought in on that. And I think that's where knowing your people, and Lou, you were talking about that gap. I think relationships can come into the chaos of that gap and help people understand where are the weak points, where are people not aligned, where are we going to get teams defecting, because where I've seen this, break down in organizations is, the company says this is our goal, but there's the team over here that's like, yeah, but that's really not what we're going to do. And so we're just not going to play ball. And then the whole thing breaks down. You're not going to meet your goals. So I have seen when incentives are aligned or goals from top down, and everybody has goals that roll up and can see why my goal on this team is important for this team. And so I need to give some of my time to do some cross-functional work here, or I need to set aside what I thought was my priority in favor of this other priority, because I understand that this is the thing that's going to get us where we're trying to go. I think if people don't understand that, they frankly won't care and won't do their best work and won't align around those incentives and won't align around that team that maybe has the composition to get you there. But if you've got a lot of people who aren't invested in that, I think that it can break down from that perspective as well.
How do you think you identify? So a lot of that becomes kind of passive aggressive behavior. And the reason it does that is people might be 3 years from retirement or 2 years from some goal, or, they don't want to relocate. I mean, there's lots of reasons. How do you think you surface that lack of alignment?
I think it's through powerful questions. I think it's in knowing who has the best relationship in those spaces to go ask some really tough or maybe hard questions about, hey, I see you're doing this. We've agreed this is our goal, and I see you doing that. There's a disconnect there. Help me understand that. And I think it's approaching it with curiosity, but you've got to have the relationships and the right people to do that. Because I think if you have somebody who hasn't shown an interest, or this person doesn't believe that, this leader cares about them, then you're not going to get the right answers. And I think it takes time. I think you really have to keep digging and keep digging. And when, that I've had these experiences where I think something's not right here, there's something they're not saying, so you keep working and chipping away at that. But I don't think there's a one size fits all. Oh, we're just going to ask this one question and everything will be illuminated. I think that's a process over time.
This is interesting. This is very interesting. We're pretty much out of time, but I would love just like really quickly to just dive a little bit deeper on Jeanna's point about the composition of the team, because I think what you're sharing about the composition of the team being critical, I think underestimates severely how bad we are at identifying talented people in the interview process. I think as humans, we are awful at identifying who would be a really good culture fit, understands the motivation. It would be a great composition for our team. I think we're really not good judges of talent and people, and at least in the current format in which interviews are taking place. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about identifying who has the right composition for being in the role? Because in hindsight, yeah, the JCPenney hiring the Apple person wasn't a right fit, but like at the time, it probably looked like a slam dunk. There wasn't, I would imagine there was a lot of people who were in that interview. I would imagine it wasn't a one interview process. It was probably like countless interviews with groups of people, and everybody gives the thumbs up and the sign off. And, in hindsight, it was like, whoa, what were you thinking? But how do we go about overcoming our own pitfalls in the interview process?
I think there's two kind of tiers to that, because you mentioned the C-level, and at the C-level, they very may well have done exactly what you said. We don't like these customers. We want different customers. So that may have been very deliberate and intentional. And if they thought they could pull it off, then they did it. Again, but the other side of that is, they thought that this was the right thing to do. So we can't possibly know that. So I think the C-level kind of has to be a different answer. For the normal interview process, what seems to work the best is the network, finding somebody who knows somebody. And those are the most successful hires I've seen. I worked at various technology and telecommunications companies, and everywhere you could find 3 or 4 people who knew that person and said they're good at this, could work on that. That works. The other thing is to the extent that you can create an apprentice environment. So consulting firms are really good at that. They hire somebody they think is bright and then just put them in different situations and see where they tend to flourish and then match them to that. So I think those are some things that they take a little bit more investment, but that is, to get a good hire, that's what you need to do.
Lou, Kaitlyn, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, we to your point, there's no magic here. We try to get a very broad audience in front of the candidates to ask different questions, different lenses. At Q2, our HR group is really progressive, and they're ahead of us trying to help us solve some of these hard problems. And we have kind of tools that help us look at behaviors and competencies that we find align with our teams and our stuff. And very specific questions and tactics to be able to kind of probe and use as tools to help, identify matches better than managers just kind of rolling off kind of their playbook. And we found that to be pretty successful. And then the onboarding then really is very intense around bringing people up to speed very quickly into our culture, into the job expectations. And then identifying problems early, and whether we can fix these problems or maybe admit to a mistake and tap out sooner than later. And I think the biggest issue most organizations have over time is that they don't address the problems quickly enough. And, we always like to say that, good news is bad news delivered soon enough that we can fix it. And so how do we know that there's a problem, talk about a problem, get a plan, be intentional about the fixing of the problem, and agree to part ways if it was a mismatch, and just not, not let that problem become a fester that then hurts the team.
Yep, I agree with that. I think companies are too slow to address problems and, like you said, part ways and make it a good thing for everybody. This isn't the right fit. But I also think training for the people who are doing the interviewing. I don't think people, they kind of just get promoted up and up and up. And so all of a sudden they're hiring for these large teams. But do they have any experience? Do they have any background in what a good interview looks like, the right questions to ask? If you have a good HR team, they're going to help you with that. But I think providing the tools for people on the front end to try to make, have better interview processes, make better hires, and then when you make a mistake, admit it and hire somebody else for that seat.
Amazing. Well, Lou, Kaitlyn, Jeanna, this was awesome. Very great pre-symposium panel. For anybody watching this, if you want to meet these 3 incredible leaders, come to our executive symposium in a couple of days. I'll post in the comment section of this video how to RSVP. Would love to see you all there. Thanks for your time today, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple of days at our executive symposium in Austin, February 15th, 5 to 8 p.m. on the topic, how to build a culture of